Avengers Endgame took secrecy to all new levels with its intentionally spoiler-free marketing efforts. Once the movie was released, though, the behind-the-scenes info began pouring out. Here are some of the most interesting things to emerge. It's a well-known fact that directors Joe and Anthony Russo will go to extreme lengths to keep their Marvel creations under wraps. For example, they teasingly apologized to the spoiler-prone Tom Holland for dusting Spidey at the end of Infinity War and consequently keeping him at arm's length for the promotion of Endgame. They also pretended to fire Mark Ruffalo after a string of spoilers had put him on thin ice. One of the best methods for keeping everyone in the dark, though, was the way the Russos handled the script. Most of the actors got only pieces of the screenplay to work from, and apparently Ruffalo got a particularly spoiler-proof version of the script. The Hulk actor was only given a partial script with additional dummy scenes in it, according to an interview with E! News.
I don't know what's gonna happen. I'm shot 5 different endings to this movie.
Really?
I didn't even get a whole script to this movie.
But even that didn't stop him from accidentally giving something away. In that same interview, he joked about what he presumably thought was one of those dummy scenes. The spoiler?
He gets married in this.
They have to throw Mark off the scent.
Oops. Endgame is the second MCU outing for Carol Danvers, who arrived on the scene just weeks earlier in her own superhero flick, Captain Marvel. For actress Brie Larson, though, that wasn't the case. Larson had filmed her scenes for Endgame before she ever had a chance to flesh out the character in her own film. As an added twist, the first scene she ever filmed was set during the events of Endgame, but technically ended up in Captain Marvel. On The Tonight Show, Larson recalled that her first day of filming was for the end credits scene for her own film, which showed her arriving at the Avengers facility post-snap.
So Whip pans to me and I go, "Where's Fury?" I didn't know that was the tag for Captain Marvel. I didn't know what that was that we were shooting. There was also nobody else there.
In true Russo fashion, though, the actress was only given her lines and filmed her part alone in front of a green screen. That's taking secrecy to a whole new level. While the Russo brothers bent over backwards to keep actors like Ruffalo, Holland, and Larson from spoiling the script, there was one person that they didn't mind showing the whole thing to: Robert Downey Jr. While discussing Infinity War and Endgame in an interview with Rotten Tomatoes, the pair talked about keeping things secret.
RDJ was probably the only one to actually read the entire script. Evans might have read
Part of
the
our
script.
motivation to do that is it just takes a lot of pressure off of people.
Everything had started with Iron Man just a decade earlier, with Endgame ultimately serving as the Iron Avenger's swan song. It's only appropriate that RDJ would be trusted with some of the most sensitive MCU knowledge to ever exist. When the Avengers break into teams for their time heist in Endgame, Rocket and Thor are sent to Asgard during the events of Thor: The Dark World to retrieve the Reality Stone. At that point in time, the stone is using the God of Thunder's ex, Jane Foster, as a host. Foster, who's been absent from Marvel films since The Dark World, appears on screen a few times before Rocket is able to get the Reality Stone out of her. But it turns out that Foster actress Natalie Portman didn't actually film any new footage for Endgame. In an interview with Entertainment Weekly, the Russos explained that they had been able to salvage unused footage from The Dark World in order to get all of the scenes they needed. While the footage was enough for them to work with, they did ask the actress to record a small bit of voiceover. In the days after Endgame lit up the theater marquees, Star-Lord actor Chris Pratt stirred up attention by releasing a video he'd taken on set while preparing for one of the film's key action sequences. The once-in-a-lifetime video showed nearly all of the famous actors, mostly in sweats and comfortable clothing, chatting and discussing their scenes as casually as if they were a group of high schoolers hanging out after class. The video gave a unique glimpse into the inner workings of a film that had been kept tightly under wraps since day one. Stan Lee was a comic book titan for over half a century. While he was an important creative mind behind the scenes for decades, his long relationship with Marvel also led to a memorable series of fan-favorite cameos throughout various Marvel movies. When Lee passed away in late 2018, fans began theorizing about when his last cameo would surface. A year earlier, it had been revealed that Lee had filmed 5 different cameos for upcoming films. The fact that he was apparently batching his cameos naturally left the possibility that he could be popping into films for an indefinite amount of time. Endgame delivered a shot of a younger-looking hippie version of Lee driving by the 1970s S.H.I.E.L.D. headquarters, shouting, "Make love, not war." As it turned out, that scene will be Lee's last ever cameo, and it's a fitting farewell. The Russos confirmed after the fact that it's the last Stan Lee cameo that made it to film. In a twist that few people saw coming in Endgame, Natasha Romanoff ended up sacrificing herself for the Soul Stone. It was a beautifully redemptive way to end her own heroic story, which had been going on in the background for nearly the entire MCU. But, of course, this is Marvel, and there's always the question of whether they'll bring her back. With Gamora's re-entrance into the future from the past in Endgame, anything is possible, except not with Romanoff. Her story seems closed for good this time. Screenwriters Christopher Marcus and Stephen McFeely explained to the New York Times her journey in our minds had come to an end if she could get the Avengers back. She has a chance to get them back, that's a thing she would trade for. During her memorial scene on the dock, the surviving hero's conversation drove home the point that the cost of the Soul Stone is a permanent one. While there's no doubt that Black Widow will be remembered by fans for years to come, she's gone for good, except presumably for her upcoming movie. While Black Widow may have ultimately been given a powerful closing to her own story, Romanoff's death wasn't always a sure thing. After all, movies aren't completely finished until the release date. The shawarma end credit scene from Avengers wasn't even added until the week that the film was released, so it should come as no surprise that there was a lot of shifting and changing as they went along. One of those changes? The events on Vormir. Writers Marcus and McFeely explained that there was a version of the script that had Clint Barton sacrificing himself for the stone instead of Romanoff. But when they gave the scene to the visual effects producer Jen Underdahl, she apparently told them, "Don't you take this away from her." The response clearly impacted the writers, who ultimately acknowledged that it had to be Romanoff. It turns out that Marcus and McFeely have had a working master document since Captain America: Civil War, where they kept track of different things they wanted to do with their heroes' character arcs. It turns out that Endgame was the movie where they got to run wild. In particular, McFeely said that they wanted to explore Marvel's tradition of what-if comics, alternate universe presentations of Marvel events playing out differently. The writers dove in and incorporated a bunch of what-if scenarios right into the Endgame plot. The writers told the New York Times, "Well, this is our what-if. If you lost, Thor becomes fat, Natasha becomes a shut-in, Steve becomes depressed, Tony gets on with his life, Hulk is a superhero, Clint becomes a murdering maniac." While there were solid reasons for every character's shift in tone, there's no doubt that the writers were happy to push the heroes out of their comfort zone for the entertainment of all. Infinity War and Endgame may be two distinctly different movies, but the subject matter that they handle is clearly interwoven. This left the writers and directors constantly scrambling to figure out how to puzzle a bunch of different pieces of storyline together in a coherent way that left them with two distinct, yet connected movies. At one point, the plan was to have Hulk and Banner resolve their differences in Infinity War. However, it felt like too much of a positive in the middle of a pretty sad ending, so the filmmakers bumped it to Endgame. They also left out the actual transformation, banking on Scott Lang in the dinner scene to provide the right amount of confusion to help bridge the gap. In the same vein, Hawkeye's opening scene in Endgame where he loses his family was nearly tacked on to the end of Infinity War, but it once again felt out of place. The biggest decision of all was where to place the snap. They debated putting it earlier in Infinity War, but it would have left almost nothing for the ending. On the other hand, if they pushed it to Endgame, it would have left the first movie with no ending at all. Knowing when to reverse the snap was nearly as challenging. Thankfully, the creative minds behind the scenes managed to eventually pull it all together into two coherent stories. Scott Lang was right, Endgame is a time heist movie. It wasn't the writers who came up with that one, though, but Marvel boss Kevin Feige himself. Feige's original suggestion was to use time travel to resolve the Infinity War plot, with the centerpiece being the Time Stone. It wasn't until the filmmakers began fleshing things out that the quantum realm became the key plot device to move the time travel element forward. Once time travel was in the mix, there was one obvious point that had to make it into the film: the Battle of New York. But the writers initially felt it was too pandery to head back to the original Avengers film, so they tried a ton of alternatives first. At one point, they had Tony Stark on Asgard in a stealth suit fighting Heimdall, and the planet Morag was originally underwater. At another point, the Avengers stopped by Triskelion and even hopped in a car to visit Doctor Strange. When the rubber hit the road, though, writers and directors alike finally decided that heading back to the Chitauri-infested streets of New York was the best option of the bunch. The sequence in Endgame when our heroes put their heist plan to the test shows that time travel within the MCU is distinctly different than the way it's been represented in movies like Time Cop, Hot Tub Time Machine, or Back to the Future.
Doc, are you telling me that you built a time machine? Out of a DeLorean?
It also establishes that Pym particles are in extremely limited supply. Tony Stark and Steve Rogers head back on a potentially one-way trip to the 70s in the hope of scrounging up more particles just to keep everything from falling apart. This left fans scratching their heads when Nebula casually brought Thanos' entire planet-sized ship and its massive army into the present. Where on earth did they get the impossibly huge number of particles to pull off a stunt like that? Joe Russo cleared up the disconnect in an interview, offering an elegantly simple solution. When 2014 Nebula surrenders the Pym particles to her father, they aren't for him to use to time travel, they're for scientific research. Thanos, a genius himself, with the help of the powerful sorcerer Ebony Maw, studied the Pym particles and then mass-produced them in order to defeat the Avengers once and for all. Check out one of our newest videos right here. Plus, even more Looper videos about the Avengers are coming soon. Subscribe to our YouTube channel and hit the bell so you don't miss a single one.